Also anathema to a large number of Chinese peasants who saw the treaty ports as an outrage, although they were just as outraged by the presence of Western missionaries in China forcing Christianity down their throats.
And yet, there would have been no Taiping Rebellion if Hong hadn't have discovered the Bible tract.
The Taiping Rebellion, extraordinary story, lasts for 14 years, 1850 to 1864. Millenarian, incredibly violent, motivated by a mystical quasi-Christianity among
But he did take seriously Jesus being more democratic and kind, basically, because if you think that Hong's army, the Taiping army, was made up mostly of peasants, the lower orders, women weren't allowed to have their feet bound anymore. You can imagine how that must have felt, that you've had for eons, you've had these awful dictatorial emperors, and suddenly here you are being told you have a soul, you have a value in the cosmos. It must have been intoxicating and liberating.
Well, but also seen as a great threat by the imperial powers. So the rebellion ended up being put down after the Second Opium War by force of Western arms.
Yes, because despite the fact that the two nations were at loggerheads over the opium, the Brits suddenly unite with the Qing emperors in order to put it down.
Absolutely. This sequence of events is very important in bringing China to the forefront in British political discussion. On one hand, the sheer brutality of the British and French intervention is something that horrifies liberal opinion in Britain. On the other hand, going to war again in order to defend the opium trade is something that disgusts more than just liberal opinion at home. So Christian moral reformers kick up a stink throughout the late 19th century about the immorality of...
So Gladstone, Cobbett...
Yeah, well, Cobbett's slightly early, but I mean, he's first Opium War, if you like, but an immense literature from late Victorian England about the horrors of the opium trade and the immorality of it. By no means all coming from the left, although, well, from liberal point of view. Although, of course, this is a two-edged sword, because the horror of the opium trade also feeds into demonisation of the Chinese users of opium. This notion that the Chinese are lazy and degenerate. And
because, of course, before Britain mass-produced opium, it was an aristocratic vice that couldn't be afforded by that many, and then suddenly the country's flooded and suddenly it becomes a national calamity as a widespread addiction.
Yeah. And in Britain, it becomes the subject of a real scare because from the 1870s onwards, small but significant community of Chinese in the East End of London in particular, later in Liverpool as well, big ports, and they're mainly sailors' lodgings and social clubs and things like that. And of course, the sailors use opium in the way that the Brits would drink beer. And
the aristocrats, of course, a lot of writers and aristocrats
leads to
here.
a gigantic moral panic about the opium craze among the Chinese and how the Chinese in line
and the whole yellow peril thing.
Corrupting.
But you can see there's all this going on. I'm thinking it must affect the collective unconscious. If you are being walked over, if your nation, you belong to a nation that's being walked over, you are now being defined as subhuman. It must do something to the ability to create, because I can't imagine that there's a sort of, I don't know, I'm not saying that artists have to be happy, but I don't know, the conditions...
Yes, they do.
We'd like to. That's what we're striving for. Anyway, it's you're listening to Madam Miao's Culture Lounge on Resonance 104.4 FM. I'm Anna Chen, and in the studio with me are Liz Lawrence and Paul Anderson, helping me unravel what cultural and scientific contributions China has made to the world, and the lovely Charles Shah Murray. Paul, you wanted to say something about that original quote that Boris Johnson about whiff waff and ping pong.
Well, there's one sort of little-known fact. Boris is to a certain extent right about ping pong being a British export to China. What he didn't say, the person most responsible for exporting ping pong or table tennis from Britain to China was a communist admirer of Mao's regime, Ivor Montagu, who was the chief of the International Table Tennis Organisation, the name of which I've completely forgotten. He was a frequent traveller to China during the period when it was, under the communists, pretty much closed to everyone apart from people on official trips. So that's the period, really, from 1949 all the way through to the...
so that's incredible. So it wasn't some sort of Bullingdon bully taking it out there, some officer nicer class. It was a communist who took it out there, and then the Chinese went and whipped the world at ping pong.
He was a posh communist. He was not
a horny-handed son of toil.
Well, thank you. The horny-handed bit brings us to the end of today's programme.